what would be some red flags? And let's ask that maybe a different way. You're going there, and here are these like the top things to be concerned about.
Well, first of all, I cite the walls, right? You look outside from a distance and you look at the building from all angles and you look for deviations, right? You look for leans, for hogs in the wall, on what they call in the masonry trade. You look at the windows and doorways to make sure they're not skewed, signs of unanticipated structural or foundation movement, and just get a general sense for, of course, I'm sure you've run into issues with moisture in your buildings, right? Water, winds is what people say. Moisture management is huge, and most of that results from how the exterior walls were constructed. We talked a little bit before about the difference between new buildings and old buildings. And older buildings were built with more mass, right? The materials were generally more robust. They can take some moisture exposure without starting to crumble. They can get wet and dry and get wet and dry without a lot of outward sign of deterioration. And new buildings are pretty much the opposite, right? They're built with materials that are lighter, less dense, and more subject to deterioration from moisture exposure.
Yeah, and that right before, that's one thing before we turn the mics on, we were chatting about, because it would surprise people where you would think, I'm buying a new property, this should be, essentially there's no issues. Or if you're buying a 100-year-old building, there's going to be a lot of issues.
Right.
And from my experience, I would say it's really the opposite.
Absolutely.
Where, when you say more dense, what that looks like, let's say with the masonry, it's 3 bricks deep, and then in the wall, then you don't really even need insulation then, and then water is very tough to get in through all that. Where nowadays you build something new, you have like a cinder block behind it, and then a space, and then 1 brick. Where now it's with the design saying water will get in, and then we'll have these flashings and catch the water and go out.
Right.
Which the flashings are always ripped or missing, or some. I don't think I've ever been to a building where I've been like, oh, this was flashed really well. I'm feeling good about this new building.
Right.
Usually it's the opposite, where you're just looking at a new building and there's a issue. And we've had, whether it's from a roof or masonry, we've had, I don't know, like a lot of water all over the place. So if you're a new investor, and you're buying brick buildings, that's actually surprisingly to be expected if you're me at this point, that there will be taking some water. Where my grandparents, they had this brick duplex in Milwaukee that they lived in for basically their whole lives. And
never
then,
leaked, right?
Yeah. It's just like a bomb shelter, basically.
Right.
This thing was solid and had a pitched roof, which that's something.
Makes a big difference.
Yeah. Why don't you... So if you're looking at a building...
especially a concrete block building, right? They call that single wythe construction. You said how these older buildings had 3 layers of brick. Those are called wythes, right? That vertical plane of brick. And each vertical plane has a space in between. So that's why it's so hard for water to get all the way to the interior, because you have the outside facade of the brick, then a space, another vertical layer or plane of brick, and then a third one. And for water to get all the way through to the interior is pretty difficult. So
and then sometimes they turn one of the bricks too, make it a longer.
Well, that's how in older buildings you can tell if it's brick veneer or solid masonry, right? If it's 2 layers or more of brick, or just 1 layer over a wood frame wall. If every 7th horizontal course they turned 1 brick sideways, that's how they locked those 2 whites of masonry together. Just like if you're stacking pallets, stacking boxes on a pallets, right? You're going to turn 1 sideways to lock those together. It's the same thing with the masonry wall. That's how they did it. Nowadays, they'll use masonry anchors or ties, galvanized or stainless steel ties that are concealed, and they don't turn that brick sideways anymore. That's called the head joint that you would see, the edge, the end of the brick.
And that's going in through the brick and then the block behind it then, or where's that
going? And you can have either brick and brick, right? 2 brick wythes or planes of brick, or brick and block. And the reason people use block is because they're bigger, less labor intensive to lay them, right? You can lay a lot more block in one day than you can brick, and labor, everybody wants to keep labor costs down. We had a presentation by a forensic building investigator, And that's exactly what he said. The bulk of his work is new construction because it's much more subject to moisture penetration issues.
Yeah.
And water is what creates most problems in buildings.
Yeah. So then just to circle back, so for issues, or call it red flags, number one was structural. If you see something bowing out or not straight, or you're a good one was if the doors aren't closing, let's say it's hitting, or the locks don't line up. Could be something just related to the door. It could be something with foundational and structural.
Or it could be normal lumber shrinkage. A lot of the lumber is damp when it goes in and then shrinks over the first year or so as the moisture kind of acclimatizes. And then that can cause some movement too.
Thanks for joining us on the Rise and Invest podcast. Please be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you enjoy your podcasts. If you'd like to dive even deeper into real estate investing, check out our company's website, riseinvest.com. If you are an accredited investor, you can get started today as a passive investor in our multifamily investment opportunities by hitting the Invest Now button on our website.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Drew Breneman and guests as of the date of recording and do not purport to reflect the views or opinions of Rise Invest Holdings LLC and its subsidiaries. The views and opinions are provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon or deemed as investment or tax advice or an offer to buy or sell securities, and the speaker cannot be held responsible for any direct or incidental loss incurred by applying any of the information offered.